Talk with a man out of a window, a proper saying. Much ado about nothing. We must proceed with our extracts from Miss Mannering's letters, which throw light upon natural good sense, principle, and feelings, blemished by an imperfect education, and the folly of a misjudging mother, who called her husband in her heart a tyrant until she feared him as such, and read romances until she became so enamored of the complicated intrigues which they contain, as to assume the management of a little family novel of her own, and constitute her daughter, a girl of 16, the principal heroine. She delighted in petty mystery, and intrigue, and secrets, and yet trembled at the indignation which these paltry maneuvers excited in her husband's mind. Thus she frequently entered upon a scheme merely for pleasure, or perhaps for the love of contradiction, plunged deeper into it than she was aware, endeavored to extricate herself by new arts, or to cover her error by dissimulation, became involved in meshes of her own weaving, and was forced to carry on, for fear of discovery, machinations which she had at first resorted to in mere wantonness. Fortunately, the young man whom she so imprudently introduced into her intimate society, and encouraged to look up to her daughter, had a fund of principle and honest pride, which rendered him a safer intimate than Mrs. Mannering ought to have dared to hope or expect. The obscurity of his birth could alone he objected to him, in every other respect. With prospects bright upon the world he came. Pure love of virtue, strong desire of fame. Men watched the way his lofty mind would take, and all foretold the progress he would make. But it could not be expected that he should resist the snare which Mrs. Mannering's imprudence threw in his way, or avoid becoming attached to a young lady, whose beauty and manners might have justified his passion, even in scenes where these are more generally met with, than in a remote fortress in our Indian settlements. The scenes which followed have been partly detailed in Mannering's letter to Mr. Mervyn, and to expand what is there stated into further explanation, would be to abuse the patience of our readers. We shall, therefore, proceed with our promised extracts from Miss Mannering's letters to her friend. Sixth extract. I have seen him again, Matilda, seen him twice. I have used every argument to convince him that this secret intercourse is dangerous to us both. I even pressed him to pursue his views of fortune without further regard to me, and to consider my peace of mind as sufficiently secured by the knowledge that he had not fallen under my father's sword. He answers, but how can I detail all he has to answer? He claims those hopes as his due which my mother permitted him to entertain, and would persuade me to the madness of a union without my father's sanction. But to this, Matilda, I will not be persuaded. I have resisted, I have subdued, the rebellious feelings which arose to aid his plea, yet how to extricate myself from this unhappy labyrinth, in which fate and folly have entangled us both? I have thought upon it, Matilda, till my head is almost giddy, nor can I conceive a better plan than to make a full confession to my father. He deserves it, for his kindness is unceasing, and I think I have observed in his character, since I have studied it more nearly, that his harsher feelings are chiefly excited where he suspects deceit or imposition, and in that respect, perhaps, his character was formerly misunderstood by one who was dear to him. He has, too, a tinge of romance in his disposition, and I have seen the narrative of a generous action, a trait of heroism, or virtuous self-denial, extract tears from him, which refuse to flow at a tale of mere distress. But then, Brown urges, that he is personally hostile to him, and the obscurity of his birth, that would be indeed a stumbling block. Oh Matilda, I hope none of your ancestors ever fought at Poictiers or Agincourt. If it were not for the veneration which my father attaches to the memory of old Sir Miles Mannering, I should make out my explanation with half the tremor which must now attend it. Seventh extract. I have this instant received your letter, your most welcome letter. Thanks, my dearest friend, for your sympathy and your counsels. I can only repay them with unbounded confidence. You ask me, what Brown is by origin, that his descent should be so displeasing to my father. His story is shortly told. He is of Scottish extraction, but, being left an orphan, his education was undertaken by a family of relations, settled in Holland. He was bred to commerce, and sent very early to one of our settlements in the east, where his guardian had a correspondent. But this correspondent was dead when he arrived in India, and he had no other resource than to offer himself as a clerk to a counting house. The breaking out of the war, and the straits to which we were at first reduced, threw the army open to all young men who were disposed to embrace that mode of life, and Brown, whose genius had a strong military tendency, was the first to leave what might have been the road to wealth, and to choose that of fame. The rest of his history is well known to you, but conceive the irritation of my father, who despises commerce, though, by the way, the best part of his property was made in that honorable profession by my great-uncle, and has a particular antipathy to the Dutch. Think with what ear he would be likely to receive proposals for his only child from Van Beest Brown, educated for charity by the house of Van Beest in Van Bruggen. Oh, Matilda, it will never do, nay, so childish am I hardly can help sympathizing with his aristocratic feelings. Mrs. Van Beest Brown. The name has little to recommend it, to be sure. What children we are! 8th extract. It is all over now, Matilda. I shall never have courage to tell my father, nay, most deeply do I fear he has already learned my secret from another quarter, which will entirely remove the grace of my communication, and ruin whatever gleam of hope I had ventured to connect with it. Yesternight, Brown came as usual, and his flageolet on the lake announced his approach. We had agreed that he should continue to use this signal. These romantic lakes attract numerous visitors, who indulge their enthusiasm in visiting the scenery at all hours, and we hoped that if Brown were noticed from the house, he might pass for one of those admirers of nature, who was giving vent to his feelings through the medium of music. The sounds might also be my apology, should I be observed on the balcony. But last night, while I was eagerly enforcing my plan of a full confession to my father, which he as earnestly deprecated, we heard the window of Mr. Mervyn's library, which is under my room, open softly. I signed to Brown to make his retreat, and immediately re-entered, with some faint hopes that our interview had not been observed. But, alas! Matilda, these hopes vanished the instant I beheld Mr. Mervyn's countenance at breakfast the next morning. He looked so provokingly intelligent and confidential, that, had I dared, I could have been more angry than ever I was in my life, but I must be on good behavior, and my walks are now limited within his farm precincts, where the good gentleman can amble along by my side without inconvenience. I have detected him once or twice attempting to sound my thoughts, and watch the expression of my countenance. He has talked of the flageolet more than once, and has, at different times, made eulogiums upon the watchfulness and ferocity of his dogs, and the regularity with which the keeper makes his rounds with a loaded fowling piece. He mentioned even man-traps and spring-guns. I should be loath to affront my father's old friend in his own house, but I do long to show him that I am my father's daughter, a fact of which Mr. Mervyn will certainly be convinced, if ever I trust my voice and temper with a reply to these indirect hints. Of one thing I am certain, I am grateful to him on that account, he has not told Mrs. Mervyn. Lord help me, I should have had such lectures about the dangers of love and the night air on the lake, the risk arising from colds and fortune hunters, the comfort and convenience of sackway and closed windows. I cannot help trifling, Matilda, though my heart is sad enough. What Brown will do I cannot guess. I presume, however, the fear of detection prevents his resuming his nocturnal visits. He lodges at an inn on the opposite shore of the lake, under the name, he tells me, of Dawson. He has a bad choice in names, that be allowed. He has not left the army, I believe, but he says nothing of his present views. To complete my anxiety, my father is returned suddenly, and in high displeasure. Our good hostess, as I learned from a bustling conversation between her housekeeper and her, had no expectation of seeing him for a week, but I rather suspect his arrival was no surprise to his friend Mr. Mervyn. His manner to me was singularly cold and constrained, sufficiently so to have damped all the courage with which I once resolved to throw myself on his generosity. He lays the blame of his being discomposed and out of humour to the loss of a purchase in the southwest of Scotland, on which he had set his heart, but I do not suspect his equanimity of being so easily thrown off its balance. His first excursion was with Mr. Mervyn's barge across the lake, to the inn I have mentioned. You may imagine the agony with which I waited his return had he recognized Brown, who can guess the consequence? He returned, however, apparently without having made any discovery. I understand that in consequence of his late disappointment, he means now to hire a house in the neighborhood of this same Ellangowan, of which I am doomed to hear so much. He seems to think it probable that the estate for which he wishes may soon be again in the market. I will not send away this letter until I hear more distinctly what are his intentions.